Hello everyone. In this video, I want to provide an overview of how you can set up a constraint layout programmatically at runtime in Android. Now, in a previous video, I went over how you could set up a constraint layout at compile time, so to speak, using XML and the design editor. Here's one of the demos I showed in that video. Here I have a 2x2 grid of buttons that equally share the available screen space. In the preview on the right here, I have a pixel shown in landscape orientation. I'll put it to portrait, and you can see that in both orientations, and even if I switch to a different pixel, maybe we'll do pixel 5, it still looks good. This is set up using Constraint Layout. If you haven't worked with Constraint Layout before, please check out that video, as it is going to be crucial to your understanding of what we're going to do in this video, which is recreate this demo, but not using XML, using Java. Now, there are two main ways to do this. The first is using the ConstraintLayout.LayoutParams nested class. I have the documentation pulled up here. It says, this class contains the different attributes specifying how a view wants to be laid out inside of a constraint layout. For building up constraints at runtime, using ConstraintSet is recommended. So that brings us to the second way you can do this, which is with ConstraintSet. Here's ConstraintSet's documentation. It says, this class allows you to define programmatically a set of constraints to be used with constraint layout. All right, so we have two ways to do this, which I think makes it a little bit tricky to get started, hence this video and the next video I'm going to make, which is going to show how to do this without ConstraintSet. I figured we'll start with ConstraintSet because it's the recommended approach, but then I'll also show you the other way, just in case you want to know how to do it, or you need to drop down into the ConstraintLayout.LayoutParams level. So what I have set up is a brand new Android Studio project called Programmatic GUI Fun, or GUI for Graphical User Interface. Programmatic GUI Fun. I have two classes here. The first is main activity. All I've done to set up this project in main activity is comment out line 12, which is set content view to r.layout.activity main. So this line of code was inflating main activity's layout from the activity main XML file, the one you get with the empty activity template in Android Studio. My goal is to show you how you can set up a constraint layout without using XML, hence why line 12 is commented out. Next, what I did is I created a second class called myConstraintLayout, which inherits from ConstraintLayout. I haven't added anything more than just a constructor to get this code to compile. What I did was I created a myConstraintLayout object, and then I set that as the content view so that when I run this project, we'll be seeing all of the views we're setting up in myConstraintLayout, nothing we're setting up in XML. This is all we have to do in main activity. The rest of our work is going to be in myConstraintLayout as we write code to recreate this demo here. I'll refer to this demo a few times throughout the video just to point out where the constraints are coming from, like why button 1's bottom is going to the top of button 3, etc. If you want to see me derive this demo for more of an intuition on how the constraints themselves were originally designed, please check out that prior video. All right. So a little bit of notes will be sprinkled throughout. And like I said, we're going to be using ConstraintSet in this video. So first, we need to set some attributes for our constraint layout. First and foremost, it is good practice to set an ID for our constraint layout, just like we would in XML. So let's do that. I'll do set ID. This is a method that we inherit from constraint layout's hierarchy. I'll do view.generateID. This is a static method that will generate a unique ID for us. We don't need to know exactly what the value of that ID is. We just need to set it once, and then we can use a getter later to get it when we need it. Another way you could generate an ID would be to set up an ID resource file and start putting in IDs there that you use here, but I find this is simpler. All right, Next, we need to set up some layout parameters for our constraint layout, namely its width and its height. Those are two view attributes that every view needs to have. What's its size? Since we want our constraint layout to be our root layout for our main activity, we're going to set it up so that our constraint layout's width and height are set to match parent. So to do this, we're going to use the general viewGroup.LayoutParams nested class. So viewGroup.LayoutParams. All right, two arguments will pass in. The first will be layoutParams.matchParent, and the second will be layoutParams.matchParent. Match parent so that our constraint layout fills all the available space. My font size is pretty large here so that everything's really readable, which means I'll probably be breaking long lines across multiple lines. All right, just because we declared these layout parameters doesn't mean that they're being applied to our constraint layout. So we're going to call set layout params, which is inherited from the constraint layout hierarchy. Pass in layout params. And now our constraint layout should be filling all the available space. What we should also do is set the background color on our constraint layout so that we can run our app and visually confirm that that is the case. So let's set another attribute. We'll do set background color, get resources, .get color, and we'll pass in r.color. Really pick any color you want that's not too hard on the eyes. I like purple 200 because it goes with the purple theme and it's kind of a nice pastel, easy on the eyes color. So let's run this and we'll take a look at the emulator and make sure that we've got this nice purple constraint layout filling all the available screen space. And it looks like we do. Awesome. So to recap what we've done so far, essentially everything that we could do in XML to set up a constraint layout, we can do in Java. There's an object-oriented programming interface to do so. For example, setting an ID, that's an inherited method. Setting a background color, that's an inherited method. Setting layout parameters, including layout parameters such as the width and the height. We can do that with the viewGroup.LayoutParams class. All right, next, we need to set up our child views and their constraints. So recall that I said earlier there are two ways to do this. The first way, which is not the recommended way as per the documentation, is to use the ConstraintLayout.LayoutParams class to directly manipulate constraint values. The second way, which is what we're going to do in this video, so perhaps I'll put some stars around this so that it's really clear, is to use the ConstraintSet convenience class to indirectly manipulate constraint values. And just to be complete, the stars represent the preferred approach. We saw that in the documentation. All right, so we need to set up a constraint set then. So let's declare a new constraint set reference. Okay, following the documentation, it says constraint sets can be created in various ways, manually from an r.layout object or from a constraint layout. We're going to do this bottom one here from a constraint layout because we have a constraint layout. So we'll do ConstraintSet.clone and we'll pass in this, which refers to our constraint layout that we're setting up. This will be nice because then our constraint set will know what the parent is when it starts making connections, say button 1 start goes to parent or button 1's top goes to parent. So I'm going to do ConstraintSet.clone, passing in this. Okay, here's where we're going to set everything up, including declaring the child views, which will be 4 buttons, connecting them via constraints, etc. Before I forget, once we're done doing that, we need to essentially pass the constraint set to the constraint layout for rendering. So let's do that before we forget. So we'll do ConstraintSet.apply to, and we can apply this constraint set to a constraint layout, which once again will be the this reference because we are in the constraint layout class. All right. Let's declare a method to set everything up because it's going to get a little bit tedious, especially since we're going to set this up in a very hard-coded fashion. I think that's the best way to get started learning this, is not to go right ahead and try to write a general n by n method to create n by n buttons in a grid, but instead to just do this simple 2 by 2. But that's really one of the beauties of doing all of this in Java or in a programming language, is we have the freedom to dynamically generate our content. So if we wanted to build, say, an n by n grid of buttons where n is entered by the user at runtime, we could do that. We could build a 5 by 5 if they want a 5 by 5. We could do a 10 by 10 if they want a 10 by 10. Right? That's not something that we can do dynamically with XML. All right. So I'm going to call this method hard-coded 2 by 2 grid of buttons. I know it's kind of a long name, but I want to be very, very, very clear that this is going to be a hard-coded solution. There'll be a lot of copy pasting involved, which makes us uneasy as programmers because every time we copy and paste, we're introducing redundancy and possibly errors. So I'm not saying this is the best way to do this, but this is a good way to learn. All right, so we're going to pass in a context. We'll need this for creating our child views, which will be 4 buttons, and also the constraint set, which we will need in order to start connecting our child views to themselves and to their parent, which is the constraint layout. So let's call this method hard-coded 2 by 2 grid of buttons, passing in the context. We're in the constructor still, so we have access to that right here. That'll be a reference to main activity, and then we'll pass in constraint set, the one we just created and are now going to utilize. All right, so let's start by creating a single button. We'll do button 1. It's going to be pinned to the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Once we can get that button created and constrained, and we can prove that we can see it when we run our app and it looks like it's properly being constrained, then we'll do button 2, which will be in the same row. That will essentially be kind of a template for the next row, button 3 and 4, and we'll be done. All right, so let's begin. So button, okay, so this is truly a reference to a button, but it's going to be a button that we're going to create, not one that we're going to get a reference to with find view by ID. So I'm going to call this button 1 and new button, and we've got to pass in a context, which we have from the parameter. Okay, just once again, we are creating a new button here. We're not simply just getting a reference to an already inflated button from XML with find view by ID. All right. We're going to need to set the ID for the button. Once again, we'll just use that convenient static method, generate view ID. We'll set it and forget it, and then we'll just use get ID when we need to get it. All right, next, let's do set text so that we can easily identify which button we're looking at. And we'll do add view, which is an inherited method where we can add this button to its parent, which is the constraint layout. Okay, recall that every view needs to declare its size via width and height. So we'll use the constraint set to do this by constraining its width and height to be wrap content. Later we'll come back and set it to be match constraint so that it fills the available space. But let's just start with wrap content so we can get all 4 buttons on the screen easily, and then it'll just be a really quick fix to make them fill all the available space. All right, so constraint set dot constrain width. Okay, we need to pass in a view ID, so that's what we call the getter. And then we need to pass in a constant representing the width, so this will be wrap content. I'm going to copy this line for the height. Now with constraint layout, every view needs at least one vertical and at least one horizontal constraint. So let's add button 1's vertical and horizontal constraints. I'm going to add the minimum 2 right now, and then once we create the remaining buttons, we'll be able to fully constrain it by adding 2 additional constraints, 1 more vertical and 1 more horizontal. All right, so we use the connect method to do this. So we'll do ConstraintSet.connect. You can see that connect is overloaded. I've got 2 options here. It's kind of hard to see with the font size so large, but the second one has a 5th parameter, which is the margin or the spacing that should go around these 2 views. All right, so we're going to specify start ID and then an anchor point on that starting view ID, and then another view to constrain to and an anchor point on that view. All right, so let's start with 1's start to parent start, and then we'll do 1's top to parent top. Okay, so the starting ID is going to be button1.getID. Okay, its anchor point is its start, so this will be ConstraintSet.start. Okay, we're going to constrain this to the parent, which I have an option here. I can call getID on my constraint layout to get an ID for the current constraint layout, right? This. Or since I used clone earlier, I can simply use a constant in order to refer to the parent ID. And that's what I'll do. I'll do ConstraintSet.parent_ID. And we want to constrain to the parent start. So I like to read this out loud because I think it makes the most sense. So button1 start goes to parent start, which is exactly this little tiny arrow relationship right here. In fact, let's be really explicit and let's just copy that right out of XML and put it in a comment below so that it's clear. So we're doing button1 start to start of parent, and here is that constraint using ConstraintSet and the connect method. All right, now I'm going to copy and paste and do the same thing for top to top. And now I'm ready to run this and see if I can get my button 1 to show up in the upper left-hand corner. And there it is. Awesome. So far, so good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add button 2, and we're essentially going to set up our first row of buttons. So here's where that copying and pasting comes in. So I'm going to copy button 1 and paste it to make button 2. Remember, when you copy and paste, it can be very error prone, so make sure that you do this very carefully, or it can lead to bugs that are pretty difficult to track down. What I like to do after updating a copy paste, which remember, it's not usually the best design, is just click on the reference that was copied and make sure that it doesn't make an appearance in what I just changed. So button 1 is up here in the button 1 block, button 2 is down here in the button 2 block. All right, now I'm gonna copy my button 1 constraint code and paste it for button 2, but I'm going to make this a little bit more succinct here. We don't need these comments anymore. They're just taking up space. So button 2 is going to be wrap content for the width and the height, and then we're going to constrain button 2's start to the end of button 1. Okay, button 2's top is going to be vertically aligned with button 1. So I am going to put button 1 in here again. So top of button 2 goes to the top of button 1. I'm actually going to repeat this for the bottom so they are fully vertically aligned. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to do is add an end constraint, which is going to be almost the end of a nice little chain we're setting up here. So button 2's end is going to go to the parent's end. To finish this chain, what I've got to do is I've got to set button 1's end to go to button 2's start. All right, so button 2 is fully constrained. It has a start, an end, a top, and a bottom. Okay. Button 1 isn't fully constrained yet. It still doesn't have a bottom constraint. I'm not going to add its bottom constraint until we declare button 3, which will go in the same column as button 1, but below it. So let's run this and see if we can see button 2 show up in that first row next to button 1. All right, so there it is. Button 1 and 2 are centered horizontally in our screen here. Looks pretty good. I'll note one thing, which is, although we've added all of the constraints for 1 and 2 to be horizontally constrained, we haven't actually created a chain here like we would see if we were over in XML and we added these horizontal constraints. If you want to set up a chain, you can do that programmatically. The benefit of doing this is, say you want to change the chain type. For example, instead of spread, like we're seeing here, maybe you want to do spread inside where the available space is pushed all in between 1 and 2, and 1 and 2 are kind of more pinned to the outside. Or if you want to do packed, where 1 and 2 are butted up right next to each other in the middle, and all of the available space goes on the outside of 1 and 2, you could do that. All right, so let's keep cruising here. Let's do button 3 and 4 at the same time since we've got a foundation set up for how to do this. Now would be a good time to pause the video and see if you can set up the constraints for 3 and 4 to get all 4 of our buttons on the screen and centered nicely in a grid. All right, let's go through this. I'm going to start with button 3. Button 3 is most like button 1 since they're in the same column. So I'm just going to copy and paste button 1. Button 3 for now is still going to be wrap content, just like all of our other buttons. Button 3's start is going to go to the parent start. Button 3's end is actually going to go to button 4's start. Now button 3's top is going to go to button 1's bottom. And we need to add a bottom constraint for button 3. We didn't have one for button 1 because we didn't have a button 3 when we first defined button 1. So we should also go back and do that. But let's finish button 3's constraints first. So button 3's bottom goes to the parent bottom. All right, so let's add a bottom constraint now to the top of button 3 for button 1. So button 1's bottom is going to go to the top of button 3. This is nice because now we kind of have this pseudo vertical chain extending from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen through button 1 and button 3. All right, so everything is fully constrained right now, meaning it has 4 constraints. Now we just need to work on button 4, which is most similar to button 2 because they are in the same column. So button 4's start is going to go to button 3's end. They're in the same row. And then button 4's end is going to go to the parent, just like button 2. It's in the last column there. And now the last 2 constraints, button 4's top is going to go to button 3's top, and button 4's bottom is going to go to button 3's bottom. So they are vertically aligned. All right, hopefully we run this and we see all 4 of our buttons. They're all wrap content, but they're all constrained in some shape or form to the parents, top, bottom, start, and end. And so they're nicely centered in the screen here. All right, this is awesome. We are now ready to go back and change wrap content to match constraint for all of our buttons and see if they fill all the available space. We'll check it in landscape mode as well. Here it is. Let's try flipping this to a different orientation and see if they're rendered properly. Got to turn that auto rotate on, but there it is, and it looks good. All right, to recap. Instead of using XML, we set up a constraint layout programmatically in Java. All of the child views, which are buttons, and all of their constraints were set up at runtime, which gives us a lot of flexibility. If we need to dynamically set up our layout, we know how to do that now. Stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to go through this again, but instead of using the ConstraintSet, which is that convenience class we saw was recommended for setting up constraint layouts, we're going to instead just use the ConstraintLayout.LayoutParams class directly. It's not going to be any more or less code, so to speak. It's just going to be a different way of doing this that I want to make you aware of in case you come across it in your searching or in your programming. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.